Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on where you find yourself in the world. My name is Sophia Aaron, and I'm the Global Blockchain Business Council Senior Analyst. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the Global Blockchain Business Council and Global Digital Finance's Global Leaders Series. This is a weekly global town hall with policymakers and business leaders to hear their insights into their work, the state of the blockchain and digital asset industry, and current global affairs. Today, we have the pleasure to be joined by Professor Tonya Evans and our host, Mercina Tillemann, GBBC's Chief Operating Officer, for a conversation and live audience Q&A on the state of blockchain in higher education and the legal and regulatory spheres. Before we begin, I would like to briefly introduce our guest. Tonya Evans is a global leader, accomplished academic and administrator, and a world-renowned speaker with over 20 years of experience in law, innovation, academia, and entrepreneurship. She is currently visiting full professor of law at the Penn State Dickinson Law School. And prior to joining the Dickinson Law faculty, Professor Evans served as Associate Dean of Academic Affairs and a Professor of Law at the University of New Hampshire Franklin Pierce School of Law, created and directed the law's blockchain cryptocurrency and law online professional certificate program. We're so pleased to have her here with us today, and we encourage you to ask your questions at any point during today's webinar. You can submit them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and we'll take them throughout the conversation. Well, thank you so much, Tonya and Mercina, for being with us here today. And Mercina, I'll hand things over to you.
Thank you so much, Sophia, and it is truly a pleasure to be here with Tonya. I have to admit, I wish we were meeting in person. It's been a while, and of course that would be preferable, but we have to make do with present circumstances, and I'm truly grateful for the opportunity to catch up and the fact that you've taken this time to be with us. So thank you so much, Tonya.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
So I was trying to put my finger on exactly when we were last together. And I think it was either end of last year, earlier this year, but in many ways, the world we inhabit today looks and feels completely different than the one we inhabited when we were last meeting in person. And one of the most significant shifts has been a dramatic move for almost every place in the world to virtual work and virtual education. And it's something that we're really all trying to kind of get our hands around. It's not how we usually conduct business, and it presents so many different challenges. You have significant experience building virtual curriculums, and this was pre-COVID. And so I feel like you have a huge leg up from everyone else because this isn't necessarily as new for you. And I'm wondering how that experience has informed your work and your ability to advise other educators since March.
Yes, there's so much there because you're absolutely right. 2 years ago, when I set out to create the online certificate program in blockchain cryptocurrency and law at UNH, I had no idea, obviously, that it would be as prescient as it is now. I knew for sure at that moment in time that the future of education, you know, the current state of education at that time, and even to some extent today, was changed forever. That I saw the writing on the wall that there were so many corporations who are starting to bring back training in-house, making college degrees optional. We're talking about the EYs and the IBMs and the Googles of the world, nice to have, but the shift and the focus on skills and credentials instead of, you know, a lifelong litany of letters at the end of the name. I happen to have a lot of them. I'm sure that much of what I will say today is controversial. I don't think it's necessarily an either or, but a both and. There is room for expertise that's cultivated over decades, but the focus on skills and credentials and access to education was primary and paramount to address the epic global transformation, largely due to technology and innovation, automating anything that is routinized or can be replaced. So the whole idea of education was really flipped on its head, and that was before. Education in many ways has been a dinosaur for a long time, very resistant to change. Add to that law school, and you have yourself the oldest of the dinosaurs, to be sure, very slow to change. And there's some reason to that from the perspective of precedent and all of those things, but for the majority of people who need to be ready and skilled in this workforce, we have no longer focused just on blue collar or white collar, it's new collar, the skilled professional. So I thought of what ways to meet skilled professionals where they are. And so that was the impetus before COVID-19. Fast forward to COVID-19, it completely upended, I feel like in some sense it's what blockchain has done to the traditional client server model in technology. The traditional client server professor student model has been completely disrupted and decentralized. It's not just one professor giving information that is handed out to a student, but it is the interactivity, the collaborative effort of true learning in an environment that supports belonging and increases access. When I was in New Hampshire, I thought it was lovely, but not everybody's going to go to New Hampshire. But they wanted the world-class education. And so in what ways could we connect? That was the point then, and now it is critical. It is critical for people to be able to work, to play, to live, to be educated. And so when I think of the future of education, it's here. And our hand has truly been forced by COVID-19 to accelerate, even from a sustainable development goal perspective. We're focused on quality education for number 4, but that really is the foundation for so many of the other SDGs, to be sure. And we have seen many of us have already known how unequal education is, both here in the United States and abroad. But it's nothing like an epic and horrific crisis to really take off the covers so that you can see the scourge of systemic racism and inequities that are hardwired, they are baked into the fabric of education. But this is our opportunity now to use this experience to identify the pressure points and to begin to start to evaluate what needs to happen in order to go forward, to have a more sustainable, more cohesive, more collaborative, and more open education system, the microsystems, and of course the macro system at large.
Absolutely, and there are so many things there that we can kind of get into, but one of the things that you mentioned that I thought was really important was, of course, this pandemic has underscored so many of the inherent inequities that we deal with as a society that aren't as obvious to those of us who lead comfortable lives and we're able to just kind of pretend they don't exist. But you also mentioned the possibility of kind of increased opportunity coming as a result of this more virtual world. For example, you don't have to travel to New Hampshire now to get an education from one of the schools there. And I mean, that has been a huge theme, not just in education, but also in employment, in terms of attracting talent and not being constrained by geographical location. And I'm wondering, in your mind, if you can expand on that a little bit, because I think it's a very compelling point, but also what are the other aspects of this current situation that can make it more of an opportunity than a setback, just to focus on the good for a moment?
Absolutely. There has to be some good or it's a wrap. So absolutely, and that actually is part of the opportunity that you are asking about, because in the midst of what appears to be setbacks for students and even for educators as well, where are the opportunities in that? What can we learn, and what's the point of it all from an existential point of view? But two of the most important skills that one can learn and certainly cultivate in times of crisis and uncertainty, it's the uneasiness around the uncertainty of where's the beginning, middle, and end, and what does this mean for my education? What does this mean for my job opportunities, for my career, for my life? And what I have found helpful for myself and what I encourage both my law students and my other online students to do is to right-size your fear and right-size your response. So the fear comes from, again, falling behind, feeling that you're getting left behind, less of a return on investment. The education, I'm a lifelong learner. I love education for the sake of education. Not everybody approaches it that way, and education is so expensive that we do have to switch to the consumer model of where's the ROI, or the investor model. And so thinking about the job opportunities and all of those things, I focus my students on studying the trends, looking for new patterns in consumer behavior, in employer behavior, trying to align my passions with what the opportunities are. I'm a problem solver as a lawyer as well. So always looking for the ways, and technologists do the same. We have this great opportunity from a Web 3.0 perspective to figure out, if you're early in your career, what are my interests and how do I align those with what is available and what is needed? It's not that, I was hired in the middle of a pandemic and changed jobs and states in a time where people were losing their jobs. And the mantra, and it absolutely was true, that so many people were being displaced. But some areas were still hiring. Some areas were booming. And so what are the opportunities? And if you're mid-career like me, focusing on how best to reskill, to upskill, to reimagine what is possible given your expertise and interest. Maybe you did something for 20 years that you were competent in and absolutely hated. But I think for everyone, COVID-19 has been this epic pause. Everybody, as my Nana used to say, go sit down somewhere, right? We have been forced to sit and think about where we are, where we've been, but most importantly, and to your point, where we collectively and where the individual is in terms of where you're going. How do I pivot to educate myself by many different channels? And I know that we're going to talk about that in this moment in time. And even when everything else seems overwhelming, it's even more important that we focus on the controllables. I tell my students, stay in your lane, control the controllables from my athletic mindset. And so those are the things that I talk about in terms of the opportunity in the midst of this undeniable setback.
Such brilliant and actionable advice. I love that. And you mentioned something that I'd love to hear a little bit more about. Education, higher education in the United States has historically been extremely expensive. And there's been a huge barrier to entry. It results in being just a tremendous investment that people don't always see a lot of return on. And you mentioned this idea of the consumer model of education, and I'd love to hear a little bit more about what that looks like. I have been, very kind of shocked. I have one younger brother who's still actually in college, and of course there are no changes to tuition fees, even though all of his classes now are virtual. And when I think about what was most beneficial for me when I was at university, it was those interactions that took place in a classroom environment. And I'm curious to hear both how you replicate those in a virtual forum and how we move toward a more sustainable consumer model, which can include hopefully a broader swath of the population.
Right. That pivot for educators, well, first let me approach it from the student perspective, because my father is a former lieutenant colonel in the Air Force. And, when I think of, all right, we have to deal with the cards that have been dealt, and we have to figure out what's before us, what's the challenge ahead, and address it. But from the student's side, when I think about quote unquote managing expectations, I think a lot of that has to be taken off the table because students have every right to feel, in effect, a sense of a death in the loss of what they thought might be. The opportunities, I went to Northwestern. I was a scholar athlete, played tennis, and I played tennis professionally after that as well. The idea of not being able to interact or play my sport, or the impact of losing a year of thankfully mine is a socially distant sport, but if you play something else that requires a lot of contact, how that forever changes what your expectations are. That you have to grieve that loss. Really literally moving through the stages of grief. And then again, getting back to the point of right-sizing fear and response, what is possible? What is possible in the new environment that we have? We as educators have been very challenged. I had the good fortune, as you said, to have a leg up in this race, but so many who were in front of a classroom, standing there doing the same thing for 5, 10, maybe 20 years, to have to, on a dime, pivot to do something different and to replicate the best parts of in-person education that you can replicate, you absolutely should. From a pedagogical perspective, that's not always possible. When I think about student interactions in groups where I can see them off doing their work, now we have these breakout rooms in Zoom. I don't know what's going on in the breakout room. They come back and we talk, and so you try and replicate things to the extent possible, but it forces us as educators to also be lifelong learners and to figure out, how do I get to the end game of empowering these students to be excellent citizens, to contribute, to really cultivate their passions, and so that they're making a valuable contribution to the world. How do I do that? That is the goal. The method, the means, the mediums, they are changing, but there are some things that can't necessarily be replicated. Now, that being said, there's some great opportunities in technology and innovation and leveraging VR and augmented reality and a whole host of other things. It takes money, it takes time, it takes training, but those educators and institutions that support that type of, let's pivot. A lot of students already loved gaming anyway. Can we gamify the education experience? Like, in what ways can we do that so that it's not, again, that client server style siloed model of the delivery of a lecture or a Socratic method? We have to move on to be responsive to what students need in this particular moment. And that means leveraging technology. That means, staying on top of the trends and meeting students where they are so that the education meets the goal, and that we're preparing students for the jobs that don't exist yet by leveraging technology and showing them what's possible.
And I'm wondering what the innovations at the cross-section of blockchain and education are that you're most excited about and that you're working on.
So there are a few areas. There are some interesting things, although I don't know as much about this area with funding. Imagine the funding model, to your last point, is so off kilter, not only just the expense of it, but the way that students receive their money and when. Can we automate that through smart contracts and have a series of micropayments that automatically happen? The flow of money from loans to the student and the timing of it is very problematic. It was problematic when I was in school. You're just waiting for that check, and rather than having it when you need it for the services and the books and the materials that you need. So funding and payment is really, really interesting. Skills, online credentialing is my ministry. It's the thing that I love most about the possibilities of, blockchain technology, smart contract coding, and credentialing, having digital badges, which already exist, but to have that in a decentralized format, to also contemplate diplomas, that information being accessible 24/7, 365, no matter where you are. I don't know if you've ever tried to get a transcript, but I think I may be just trapped in the job that I have now because I have no interest in trying to find a transcript at this point. But for the rest of you, the younger people who have the option, being able to access that information is critical, and the current system is woefully inadequate. So many institutions have not transferred from or digitized their paper filings, and so it makes it really difficult. And we're one disaster, one fire, one hurricane away from, all of those records being forever gone and forever lost. I think, think of what happened in Puerto Rico, think of what's happening in California. So we have to make transcripts, credentials, and credentialing, COVID-19 proof, crisis proof, and blockchain has a lot to do with that. There's some really great use cases that are possible in that way. And then a final one that is not just specific to education, but one that is really exciting. And I see projects that we're talking about doing this years ago, and a lot of those projects are now either they're coming to fruition or we don't see them anymore, but projects around identification and identity. The classic example is if I'm going to purchase alcohol or I'm going to an event that requires that you're 18 and over or 21 and over, you just need to know green or red. You can come in or you can't. You don't need to know my height, my eye color, certainly not my address. And from a privacy concern, I also teach information privacy law, solutions around identity in the education space will be important too. You can actually more quickly hire. The hiring process is very long, very involved. If you're involving those that require an I-9 and all sorts of things, if you're working with, and I work constantly with educators who are not in the United States, hiring them for the certificate program is extremely difficult because of all of these arcane rules about you need to be in person with your information and the laundry list of things you need to bring. If you just had a wallet that you could scan and it could verify in real time who you are, what your accomplishments are, where you went to school, those solutions are at the ready. They're in our hands right now, and those are some of the most interesting ones to me.
So many important points there. And I mean, we at GBBC have definitely seen this year an increased level of interest in so many of the solutions empowered by blockchain. I think we've seen, and not just as we've seen, but as different governments and other institutions have recognized that the systems we rely on are not particularly resilient. They're not crisis proof. There has seemed to be renewed energy in terms of seeking out updated models, which is exciting, but it also kind of makes me realize that we're still dealing with some foundational issues which prohibit a lot of folks from taking advantage of these improvements and innovations. And a perennial theme of the pandemic has been the enormous digital gap, which exists globally and certainly throughout the United States. Last week, it was so wonderful to have you participate in this forum that we hosted with the UN based on the Sustainable Development Goals. It was fully virtual, 100 speakers, over 1,000 participants. And we had so many issues just getting people connected to the internet. Nothing needed to be downloaded. It was really just kind of connecting with high enough bandwidth to the internet to participate. And unfortunately, there were a couple of folks who just couldn't engage because they weren't able to sign in. And we were dealing with mostly very established professionals. Right. And so you can only imagine the stresses placed on others who are separated by that digital gap. And I'm wondering if you can speak to that challenge a little bit.
The digital divide, both here, as you said, in the United States and certainly around the world, emerging nations, it's tenfold the problem, maybe more than that. It is one of the most pressing and urgent challenges of our time, and need of an immediate, scalable, wholesale solution around the globe, full stop. That this is not a luxury it wasn't a luxury before COVID-19, and it 1000% is not a luxury now. And, you know, I saw a news report maybe about 3 weeks ago as students were returning to school, and I could see how, you know, the funding of a particular school system was driven by what support the school could give to children. Even at the time I was still at the University of New Hampshire, the law school, we had to reconcile that for our students there as well and set up hotspots in parking lots so that students could come, assuming they could drive there. Maybe they were a commuter. So would they drive 90 minutes, 2 hours to come and sit in the parking lot so that they could have the privilege of our education? And then to your point, everybody who was on, I think it was AirMeet, to connect, and it was a very robust and wonderful platform. I had the privilege of having very strong Wi-Fi, but others who were similarly situated, you know, from an economic point of view, still had connectivity issues. I saw something, so the news report was about students who were sitting outside of either Starbucks or McDonald's to, so that they could dial into school. They could get, you know, emotional thinking about it as well, because the report also said that some of those employees were coming out to give them food as well. It is critical that we resolve infrastructure problems. The opportunities that we can leverage in technology through a variety of Web 3.0 solutions. We can talk about the use cases and everything all day. If people don't have connectivity, broadband, both as a matter of the infrastructure, but also devices. Devices are a little bit better. Even in emerging nations, we see that a lot of people have a cell phone. It's not the S whatever or the I whatever, but it is sufficient to get connected, assuming there is connectivity. I do not have any great solutions today, but I know that it is an epic and pressing concern, and we will not be able to meet the Sustainable Development Goal of quality education without the infrastructure in place to support it.
It's certainly something that I hope future administrations will make more of a priority, as it's something that we really rely on moment to moment, and it does create even more dramatic differences in kind of social positions. And we actually have gotten a number of questions from the audience, so I'm going to go through a couple of them before getting back to my very long list. I want to make sure I give other folks a chance to glean your insights on these topics. So one question says, during the pandemic, we've seen the healthcare industry gather globally in search for a vaccine. Do you anticipate education to follow suit in order to fill this new divide in virtual learning?
So there was a blip on a couple of the words. Speaking of Wi-Fi connectivity, I hope I didn't jinx myself. Repeat that for me, make sure that I got everything out of it.
Yeah, let me repeat it. So it says, during this pandemic, we've seen the healthcare industry come together globally in search for a vaccine. Do you anticipate education to follow suit in order to fill this new divide in virtual learning?
I think it's, I will say what I believe, since I'm not in the healthcare space or healthcare education space. The point is a really great point, because resolving this crisis, I think it resides in the hands of the medical community and the education community, and they need to be aligned, working in tandem. It's definitely not an either or, but a both and it requires even more, given the political divide. It's not a political conversation, but when you don't have sufficient information, it is impossible to make the right decisions. And so medical experts, educators, academics, working very hard on these issues, these challenges, these problems, in order to resolve and accelerate the process in time to the extent that it can be. Nature is what it is, but we can do everything in our power to meet the demands that are needed at this point in time. And education plays an important role in that from an academic perspective. In every discipline in academia, scholars are focused on writing through often normatively what should be, but it's crisis points where the rubber meets the road, and we talked and guessed and guesstimated about what was possible and what could happen. Now we have to apply those learnings, the academic research and reports to say, based upon our research and our knowledge and our wisdom, different from knowledge, what is possible in this moment and under what circumstances. And it will be interesting to see what role educators also take in educating the public, because with all of the misinformation and disinformation, people are starving for the facts. Humans are resilient, or else we wouldn't still be here. We need the right information at the right time to make the right decision. And when you have new information, you get to make a new decision. And I think educators play an important role in that way to align, and there are medical educators as well. So that's the sweet spot of solving for this epic problem and concern, taking the lessons of the past and applying it to what will be a best practice, what will be the standards coming out of this as well. So some of the role of academics and educators is also saying, at some point we're going to be on the other side of this, and taking a look back and putting the pieces together to give context to what the best practices should be in effective disease, infectious disease control going forward. So that's a lifelong process as well. But I hope and I believe that educators will have a lot to do with where we go from here.
Absolutely. And you brought up an interesting point, which I'd love to focus on for a moment. The information about our current situation has been very dynamic and really constantly evolving. If we look back at what we thought was true in early March versus what we know or really believe is true now, there's a huge gap and a tremendous difference. And it is very challenging to keep information updated and accurate. And I'm wondering, you know, as I think about teachers and professors right now being already stretched very thin, needing to create curriculum, completely transform the way that they teach. For many, or maybe not digital natives, learn how to interface in a virtual environment. How do we equip and empower teachers to continuously update curriculum in order to be kind of arbiters of truth and indisputable information so that it remains relevant and accurate?
Right. We need every educator to become a blockchain. You know, resilient, immutable, all of those awesome things. First, I actually want to give a shout out to all educators, some of whom I am not, but some of whom are also parents. So required to pivot on a dime to educate other people's children while educating their own, probably at home. The stress of educating in this environment, I cannot even impress upon you. And I was an administrator. I was the associate dean of my previous law school at a time when this hit. And I do also, as an aside, want to go on record. I was one of the first people with a tinfoil hat on that said, I don't know about what the rest of you are doing, but I'm going to wear a mask until further notice. But everybody didn't get that. I'm one of those people who is going to err on the side of over caution. But educating in this space requires what is often required in education across the board, and that is updating curriculum constantly. You cannot be in front of a classroom for 5, 10, 20 years doing the same thing off of the same material on the same book that may be in its 12th edition. To press ourselves to continue to be lifelong learners so that we can encourage that in our students as well, we have to embrace technology. You're constantly reevaluating, and this is happening because our hands are being forced in this way to reevaluate every single thing we teach, even if you didn't change your course plan or an outline for a course. Everybody had to take another look. Every week we are doing that in order to figure out, how am I going to deliver this material in this medium? The technology alone has required people to have access to the technology, to learn the technology in order to be able to deliver quality education and to find a way to meet students where they are. So that is having the right technology, certainly having the right information that comes from administrators, institutions, and education systems, so that we as educators are being instructed on the pedagogy of delivery of the content. So many of us not so many of us we all focus on the content, but there's another aspect to making sure that it is delivered, prepared in a way that is most beneficial to the various learning styles of students as well, and honoring the substance of it. In being a blockchain educator, I think it's blockchain, hashtag blockchain edu, focusing on different aspects of blockchain, it changes every minute. You know, we're talking about some use cases. 3 years might as well be 30 years in this ecosystem. And so I am constantly challenged as someone who builds online. There is some pre-recorded material, but it is imperative to have the real-time interaction as well for questions, for the hot topics that come up on a daily basis, to be responsive in that way. So the education is certainly a foundation, but having the space and the flexibility to incorporate current issues and hot topics so that we know where that current state of education or that current state of that subject matter is at any given time.
Absolutely. And I feel like I could talk to you about education forever, actually. And we do have a few more questions from the audience on that, but I also want to make sure that we get into your opinions on the law and on kind of maintaining and restoring trust in our public institutions. So we will get there, but one question from the audience mentioned or kind of acknowledged that education historically has been a pretty linear journey. And they're wondering if you think that virtual education will allow for it to be a little bit more fit to purpose in terms of what individuals need, as maybe they're able to take classes one semester and then they need to stop out for a period of time without that having a really deleterious impact on kind of the ultimate goal of the educational process.
Now more than ever, that is not only possible, but essential, because of what we mentioned earlier about skills and credentials. Acquiring skills and credentials are either based on interest at any given time, but usually driven by job opportunity and, you know, the immediacy of needing it when you need it. And so being able to create modules, to modularize, I don't even know if that's a word, education in the delivery means that you don't have to focus on one purveyor of a specific topic, that you are mixing, matching the experience to customize your education experience over time. I certainly have, when I think about how I've built various online programs, is to make them fully asynchronous with an opportunity for IRL or in real life or virtual real life connection. So that gets back to kind of the both and model of, here are these 9, 12, 14 modules, self-paced, do them at your own time when you need them. Whenever you finish this, you will receive a badge. If you complete all of them, you have your full certificate or credential. And you can do them in or out of order. I love the point that it need not be linear. Unless from a pedagogical perspective, you need a foundation to then go to the next. But I also want to empower students to make their own decision. I have an idea about how things can go. I can make a suggestion. But maybe you want to jump into module 7 because it happens to be on blockchain for social impact, or the intellectual property issues and concerns, or open source software, or crypto economics or token economics. And you can mix and match based upon what you're interested and need in that moment. That's really powerful. That is the self-sovereignty that we talk about, you know, in the blockchain ecosystem and crypto, about really putting the power of self-determination, putting the self back in determination. And that certainly can begin with or be aligned with the goals of education and empowering people to make those decisions for themselves to get what they need when they need it. And education, we really need to reassess and rethink this linear model, because that takes us again back to that client server, do as I say, do this in order, regurgitate the information. There's no space for that in education right now. And that certainly is not going to solve the world's biggest and most pressing concerns in that way.
Absolutely, I couldn't agree more. And I think it's actually very exciting and encouraging to people at all stages of life to think that education can be more of a process than a destination that you arrive at and then you move on to different professional pursuits. So I think in some ways it can be much more empowering. And again, I feel like I could talk to you about education forever, but I want to move on to the legal part of your background and your career. We spoke a little bit earlier about the challenge of misinformation. And if this pandemic has highlighted anything, I think it's really underscored the importance of maintaining the public's confidence in government and institutions, particularly at a time when so many of us are counting on these larger bodies to protect us from something that none of us can really solve on our own. And even as trust in governments globally has reached all-time highs amidst COVID, leading up to that, there had been a very dramatic and steady decline in trust in all sorts of institutions. And I'm wondering, as we work to revive trust in our governments, how do we rebuild that eye toward creating resilient systems that foster transparency and accountability? And what role does the law and our legal system play in all of this? And of course, what role does blockchain play in all of this?
I'm writing down all of the words. The buzzwords. This is a really, really important question, and I feel like it ties all of the ends, not necessarily the loose ends, and brings everything that we've talked about to this point together, because we focused on the stakeholders involved in education, but taking a wider view at institutions as a whole. And I love the word resilient institutions, because it, brings us back to the impact of COVID-19. But if it's not COVID-19, it's some other crisis that is going to confound and challenge education at the institutional level, which then informs and impacts every other stakeholder and every other level in education. And so when I think about how to create resilient institutions, or the import of it, it gets back to being prepared as well at the institutional level to reskill and reimagine what is possible for students, what is possible for educators, what's possible for administrators at every level of education, because each feeds the other if we're going in the traditional model. If we upend the traditional model and we have modules and the delivery of knowledge and information based upon need, then institutions need to be prepared for that process. It is evolve or die. And again, education as we know it has been upended. And we're not just preparing someone to go back into the community, a mile away from home. We're global citizens. The technology that we love and that we're focused on is borderless. And it has its own sense of resilience and transparency, which is a hallmark, not only for the original blockchain for Bitcoin, but those that follow, to the extent that they want to have a public and permissionless and transparent system or an open source protocol. That requires cooperation. that requires cooperation across borders. If we ask that of technologists, and technologists get it, interoperability is an epic concern when you're building the technological stack. If you don't get that physical layer correct, by the time you get up to application, you'll never get to application. And the interoperability of applications, so take that same model and place it into education. That without the foundation that is open and transparent and cooperative, in order to reach the ultimate goal, we won't succeed. The sustainable development goal of quality education will never be realized without the institutional level focus on interoperability from an education perspective. And given all that's going on in our world too, there are other things in terms of systemic racism and sexism and all of the isms. You know, at my law school at Penn State Dickinson Law, we are wholly focused as a primary goal, and not just goal, but mandate, not only to not discriminate, but to be anti-racist, to actively be involved in dismantling racism at every level within every system, and education certainly is a part of that. That we are creating at the institutional level mandates for inclusion and belonging. That really, it actually serves the bottom line well. Racism is actually very expensive and not really good for the bottom line. People constantly work against their own best interests. And so informing that at the institutional level within education is a primary concern. And finally, institutions have to be prepared to pivot. That is very, as a former administrator, both as an associate dean of inclusion and equity and also the associate dean of a law school, I know how difficult and challenging that can be. I know how the sausage is made. It's not pretty, but it is required that there is always a focus on ensuring that educational institutions are ready to prepare students for the jobs and the problems that don't exist yet. That means always a forward eye, learning from the past, being mindful of the present with a focus on the future. The best and most resilient institutions will do that.
Such an important point and such a helpful answer. And just because we've gotten a few other questions on the topic, I want to make sure that we address it fully. How is blockchain making law more resilient? How does it help us to trust these systems?
So I am a huge fan of smart contract coding to facilitate performance for a range of underlying contracts. And I remember the conversations earlier on that, and when I think of Nick Szabo and the focus on get rid of the lawyers are the problem. And to some extent, he was accurate. You know, I think he went to law school as well. So I trust him in that regard. I am here to tell you lawyers are not going anywhere, but what we do is should be focused on advising and not pushing the proverbial pencil and billing $500, $700, $800 an hour to do something that can be automated. Part of my practice, and I'll, in order to get to the answer, and I'm mindful of time as well. When I started in practice, I went to Howard Law School. I clerked in the Third Circuit for a year, and then I worked in big law. And then I worked with my mom, who is a patent attorney before she's semi-retired to go into nonprofit work. And then I became an educator. So I've done a lot of things. Look young, but I've done a lot. And part of my practice early on was focused on entertainment law, literary law in particular. And I can think of so many areas in my representation of authors. Usually, I'm reviewing and negotiating contracts. I'm not necessarily doing placement of properties. I had placement, but I didn't serve the function of an agent. I'm an advisor. I'm a problem solver, making sure that I'm a zealous advocate to make sure my client gets everything they need. The agent was interested in placement and had all of the relationships in New York in particular to be able to, they're having the martinis, they're making the deals, but I'm closing the deal. And the deal may or may not close, but I'm always going to advise. one of the most important contracts or parts of a publishing agreement. And at the time it was the advent of electronic books, ebooks that are going to ruin all of publishing. Also in there were escalating royalties. This is one of the many examples where no one should have to call me or an agent or have a 6-month reserve of funds that my client does not have access to. If royalties escalate at 10% or maybe 5,000 books sold, then it goes from 10% to 12.5% and 12.5% to 15%. Once Amazon tells, is the oracle that informs a smart contract that the 5,001st book is sold, my client should get paid for that. The royalties should escalate automatically. It's what parts of contracts like that can, where you can facilitate the seamless performance without having to involve a lot of middle women or persons that are extracting a premium along the way without adding value. I recognize that. That happens all the time in law, and there's so many areas where I love the work that projects like the Accord Project are doing in order to have software banks of smart contract coding in order to facilitate performance in various ways. There will be no shortage of opportunities to provide advice and counsel, but you shouldn't be paying us to do things that can be automated in that way.
Absolutely, and I'm sorry we only have 5 minutes left, but as a final question, you mentioned that your mother was a patent attorney, which I think is just fantastic. It doesn't surprise me at all, but I love it. And I'm wondering how we encourage more women to pursue the fields of science, technology, engineering, and math. No matter how much progress we've made, women are always in the minority in those fields. And I'm just wondering if you have any ideas. I think it's such an important goal to work toward, and I would love to hear your insights.
Absolutely. Well, I'm definitely the poster child for representation matters. I grew up in Temple's Law Library when my mother was attending law school, and my father was attending medical school at Jefferson Medical School at the same time. He's a colorectal surgeon as well. So representation for women and girls matters. Seeing me, if I never attend another diversity and inclusion forum or panel again, but I'm standing in front of my classroom, or I have the great fortune and privilege to be here with you to reach people, them seeing me in a position like this makes it possible. There are young Black boys who grew up at a time and when Barack Obama was president. It's possible for them now. Or young Black girls who see Kamala Harris as the VP pick here in the States. It's possible. What I'm doing is possible for them and beyond. And so representation and just seeing us in the room where it happens, just to steal a phrase from Hamilton, is critically important. The encouragement early and often that their voice matters. So many girls are silenced early on a range of issues. If we can't trust our own voice on the little things, we will never take a leap to the big. And so even outside of science, technology, engineering, and math, supporting and hearing and amplifying the voice of girls and women is critically important so that they believe in themselves and therefore will take risks. Women are highly risk adverse because we're taught early the consequences of us making a wrong pick, a selection, can be very dangerous. So protecting girls in a way that makes sure that they know that they matter and their voice matters will go a long way. They'll find their way if we do that. We won't necessarily have to focus on the STEM, and there are other ways. We'll have to have another session to talk about all those opportunities, but empowering women to speak and to trust themselves in the process will mean that anything is possible for them. I certainly do that with some of the online work that I do outside of the legal environment or the law school environment too. I have Advantage Evans Academy, mostly focused on, it wasn't my original intention, but focusing now primarily on women and people of color, and women of color in particular, to onboard into this space. It's called From Cash to Crypto. They needed to find a place that allowed them to learn this without a science or technology background, in a way that makes it, I'm always focused on the legal aspects, but also that they are safe, and by the time they finish, that they're confident that they can go forward and focus on economic opportunity and how blockchain might be impacting their industry as a matter of generational wealth. If you empower women, you're empowering communities, because women are the center point of most families. And so that aligns nicely even just with the question of how do we get women and girls into STEM fields. It's aligning their passion with what is possible with technology now. That's how I got into the space. I learned about this 3 years ago. Again, that could be like 30 years ago. I feel like I've been doing it forever. I haven't. I'm mid-career, but I was able to pivot to be curious about what does this technology mean for me, for the future of law, and for the future of law students. That's how, my focus. And so that brought me in, my curiosity and the support of women around me to give me space to actually do and create that. So I'm encouraged. I'm encouraged about where we are and where we're going. I'm so grateful for this community at GBBC. When I think of Sandra Rowe and you and everybody who's working so hard to empower women and girls, it's organizations like this as well that make it possible for women like me to amplify my voice and to extend my reach. And so that there's so much power in that.
Well, I am also very encouraged by this conversation and learning more about all the work in which you're engaged, and so grateful for your time today. Thank you again. I wish we could just talk for the rest of the day, but we'll have to schedule part 2. And thank you again so much for making the time and sharing your insights with all of us. And thank you for being an educator right now and helping to shape the next generation of thinkers, because I really don't think there is a more noble or critical role. And I'm just so grateful that brilliant people like you are willing to serve in that capacity. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Mercina and Tonya. For everyone watching, we will provide a recording of this webinar and make it available online, and also circulate to those who weren't able to join. As a reminder, also next week, the Global Digital Finance will be hosting a conversation with Richard Byworth, CEO of Diginex and Equos. Thank you, Mercina and Tonya.
Thank you.